Now, because it's a terrible cliche to say some need no introduction, I will give a proper introduction to Mr. Joe Galloway. Mr. Galloway is a native of Refugio, Texas. He spent over 50 years until his very recent retirement as a war correspondent, writer, editor, and bureau chief for the United Press International, U.S. News and World Report, and Knight Ridder newspapers. More than 15 of those years were spent in foreign posts, Japan, Indonesia, India, Singapore, Moscow. Joe served 4 tours as a war correspondent in Vietnam. He also covered the 1971 India-Pakistan War, Desert Shield, Desert Storm from 90 to 91, and the war in Iraq, 2003, and then again 2005, 2006. Joe is perhaps most notably co-author with retired Lieutenant General Hal Moore, U.S. Army, of the national bestseller We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which gives a 2-man's eyewitness account of the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, November 1965 engagement that changed the war in Vietnam. As a young UPI reporter based in Saigon, Joe was a member of that small cadre of early British and American war correspondents, John Laurence, Sam Caston, Sean Flynn, Tim Page, Dana Stone, who also found themselves as combatants in Vietnam. For helping to rescue wounded soldiers under fire in the Ia Drang Valley, Joe was later awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Combat V. Today with John Laurence, Joe serves as a consultant to the new documentary film project, The Vietnam War, being produced by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick for 2017's release. Joe Galloway also works as a special consultant to the Vietnam War 50th Anniversary Commemoration Project, sponsored by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He and his wife, Dr. Grace Liam Galloway, live today in Concord, North Carolina. Dr. Galloway spent 3 years in Vietnam working with war orphans for Catholic relief. Among Joe's many awards, in 2005 he received the John Reagan McCrary Award from the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, and on Veterans Day 2011 received the Legacy of Service Award from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joe Galloway.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm following an awfully distinguished historian in Professor Herring. I've admired his work for, I don't know, 40 years or so. It is a pleasure to be here among so many Marines. I don't know if you know this, but the Marines landed their 1st Battalion in Da Nang in March of 1965, and I landed in Da Nang in April of '65 to cover those Marines. And I covered them for the first 7 months in Vietnam. They taught me many things about going to war. Someone always says, well, what the hell did they teach you, Joe? I said, well, they taught me how to sleep standing up, how to run laying down, that there's a right way and a wrong way and a Marine way, and the Marine way is the only way. Did I get that right, guys? I covered every Marine operation in I Corps for that 7 months, to include 1 combat amphibious assault landing, and there are not too many Marines today who can say the same thing. You know, I don't know, for some sin that I no longer remember, I'm frequently in Washington, D.C. these days, and I ran across a couple of stories that might not have penetrated the hinterland, so I'm going to tell you about them. Seems that one evening, just about dark, a tall, silver-haired, distinguished-looking gentleman wearing about a $6,000 Italian suit was walking near Capitol Hill, and a fella jumped out of the alley, stuck a pistol in his ribs, and says, "Give me your money." The guy got all indignant. He drew himself up. He said, "You can't do that to me. I'm a congressman." And the guy with the pistol says, "Okay, in that case, give me my money." The other story was a very rare 9-0 Supreme Court decision. This was before Scalia happily died. You know, that just doesn't happen, 9-0. But this is how they voted to deny Washington, D.C. the right to have a nativity scene at Christmas. Wasn't a matter of separation of church and state. It was that they could not find 3 wise men or a virgin in that town. But they did find enough asses to fill every stable in the country. I guess I'm going to have to get serious here in a minute. I was not present in Vietnam when Tet happened. I did 65 and 66, and I left swearing I would never come back to that misbegotten war. And they sent me back in 1971 for the invasion of Laos, in 1973 for the release of the POWs and the phony peace, and in 1975 I was there to watch it go down. But I missed Tet. I watched it from Tokyo with great interest, of course. My first tour, I must tell you that covering that war was something that I wanted so badly. I started begging my bosses in 1963. I started reading stories out of this place called Vietnam that were written by Neil Sheehan and David Halberstam and Malcolm Brown of the AP. And I had a feeling in my bones that this was going to become an American war. It was going to become my generation's war, and 40 years after it was over, it would be a lot easier to explain why I went there than why I did not go there. And so I drove my bosses crazy. I wrote a letter. I was in Topeka, Kansas, covering the State House for UPI, and I wrote a letter a week explaining to them why it would be so smart to send me to Vietnam, and begging and pleading and threatening, and finally came down to the point where either they fired me or they sent me. And thank God, right after the '64 election, when Johnson stood on the steps of that State House I covered and told a large audience of Kansans that he would never send American boys to fight a war that Vietnamese boys ought to be fighting themselves. Well, I came out of Texas, and I knew Lyndon lied like hell. And I was pretty sure he was lying about that too. So right after that election was over, they called me and said they were sending me to Tokyo, which was the Asia headquarters. And that got me almost to Vietnam. And I got there and I said, you know, I want to go to Saigon. And the boss said, you know, I just sent a second American to Saigon. We're never going to need more than that. And I just nodded and bided my time. And in March, there went that 1st Battalion of 9th Marines landing in Da Nang, and about 3 weeks later I was on my way. And I did those 7 months covering the Marines, and boy, you know, I heard about this new experimental air mobile division that was arriving, Army. 1st Cavalry Division, 435 helicopters in their TO&E. And I said, you know, I'm tired of walking to work with these Marines. I've I've worn out 2 pair of boondockers and a whole lot of sets of fatigues, and I've got the crotch rot and the pit rot and the foot rot and every other kind of rot. I'd like to ride to work. And so I went up to the Central Highlands and started a whole different adventure. And, you know, the things that happened in the Hydrangh Valley were not isolated, and that wasn't the beginning. It began a month before that at a Special Forces camp called Plei Me. And they were besieged by a full North Vietnamese Army regular regiment, and they were dangling those dozen Americans and 100 Vietnamese CIDG types as bait to get a relief force to come out of Pleiku, and they had another regiment sitting in ambush. Well, I wanted in there so bad, and I couldn't get a ride because they had shut down the airspace. They had shot down 2 Hueys, 2 Air Force fighter bombers, an A-1E and a B-57 Canberra, and they had the place ringed with those 51 caliber Chinese anti-aircraft machine guns, and a lot of them. And so I wasn't having any luck finding a ride, and I ran across an old Texas Aggie buddy of mine who happened to be a helicopter pilot, happened to have a helicopter. And he saw me stomping up and down the flight line. He said, "What's the matter, Joe?" And I said, "Well, I want to get into Plei Me camp, and I can't go there." And he said, "Well, the airspace is closed, dummy." I said, "I know that, but I still want to go." And he scratched his head. He said, "Well, I wouldn't mind taking a look at it myself, so come on, I'll give you a ride." That's how it worked in the early days. And so the next thing I know, I'm looking out the open door of that Huey, and it's laying on its side because we're kind of corkscrewing down. And I shot a picture out of that door, and there's that camp, triangular, barbed wire, and a lot of puffs of smoke where the mortar rounds that are landing are exploding inside that wire where we're going. And we drop in, and I jump off, and they throw a few wounded Montagnards aboard, and my buddy is pulling pitch and shooting me the finger through the plexiglass, and then he's gone, and I'm standing there, and a Special Forces sergeant comes running up, and he said, "Sir, I don't know who the hell you are, but Major Beckwith wants to see you right away." And I said, "Well, which one is he?" He says, "It's that big guy over there jumping up and down on his hat." Not a good sign. And I went over and I presented myself, not quickly, but I did. And Sergeant Charlie Beckwith says, "Who the hell are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a reporter." He said, "You know," he said, "I need everything in the damn world." He said, "I need medevac, I need food, I need ammo, I need everything. And I'd love to have a box of cigars and a bottle of Jim Beam. And what has the Army and its wisdom sent me but a goddamn reporter?" He said, and I'm still kind of from one foot to the other, and he says, "I got news for you, son. I do not have a vacancy on staff for a reporter, but I desperately need a corner machine gunner, and you're it." Well, my ride's going over that mountain, and so Beckwith gave me 10 minutes of quick instruction on the care and feeding of the 30 caliber air-cooled machine gun, and how to clear a jam and how to load it. And then his instructions were fairly simple. He said, "You can shoot the little brown men outside the wire. Don't shoot the ones inside. They belong to me." And by the way, he said, you see that bunker down there? Yeah. He said, that's manned by Vietnamese. And I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. If they turn their gun around and start shooting this way, take them out. So I'm listening to the missions there, and I spent the next 2 days and 2 nights on that machine gun, kind of like a tree full of owls. I'm looking at everything. But that was the beginning of that campaign in the Ia Drang. And when I left there, finally our relief came in, and a cavalry unit brought a battalion in, and I was going to march off with them and circle the camp and pick up all of those machine guns, which we did. Some of them with the gunner leg chained to the tripod. I went to Charlie Beckwith and said my goodbyes, and he said, you did good on that machine gun, son. I noticed that you're not carrying a piece. And I said, sir, in spite of the use that you have made of me these last 2 days and nights, I'm technically speaking a civilian non-combatant. And Beckwith looked at me and he said, ain't no such thing in these mountains, son. Sergeant Major, get him a rifle and a bag of magazines. And I left that camp with an M16 on my shoulder and 20 loaded magazines and a lot of those little boxes to fill up those magazines when they got empty. And in spite of what Hollywood would tell you in that movie, the Sergeant Major did not have to give me an M16 because I brought my own. And I was asked by Al to tell you a little bit about what it was like covering that war. And there were 2 kinds of journalists, 2 kinds of people with press cards. There were those of us, about 20 in number at any given time, who saw it as their job to cover the fighting, to cover the soldiers and the Marines, to cover every operation. And at any given time, there were about 500 who had press passes, who spent their days and nights rather more comfortably in Saigon, covering the briefings and complaining that they were being lied to. And I didn't go to Saigon very often. When I did, I would listen to their complaints and advise them that they should come out where we were, because nobody lies to you within the sound of the guns. And that's the absolute truth. I never was lied to on the ground in a combat situation. Nobody's got time for that bullshit. That happens in the rear with the gear and the sergeant major and the beer. I was a lot more comfortable out with troops, as uncomfortable as it was sleeping on the ground and burning off leeches and all of that stuff. I was a lot more comfortable out there where life was a lot simpler, and so was death. And, you know, you would go on an operation and you might stay 3 hours or 3 days or 2 weeks, but you go out with a Marine company or an Army company, and sooner or later, while they're arguing about where we are, you get to sit down, and the GI or the Marine next to you says, who are you? Your uniform's a little bit different from mine. Well, I'm a reporter. And he'd look and he'd say, you mean you're a civilian? Yeah. And you're out here with me? Yeah. damn, they must pay you a lot of money. No, I work for UPI, the cheapest outfit in the world. Ah, he'd say, then you're a crazy mother. And you know, nobody understands crazy like the infantry. Once he's got you in that pigeonhole, it's okay. And the guy next to him would say, who the hell is that? He'd say, it's some crazy reporter. And it was okay, because by the next morning, they would be saying, it's our crazy reporter. And the longer you stayed, the better it got, and the tighter your relations got. And that's how the war was covered at the pointy end of things. How it was covered in Saigon, I can't tell you. I tried to avoid that. The few times where I was in a battle and somehow managed to catch a plane and catch another plane and somehow end up in Saigon the next afternoon at the 5 o'clock Follies and listen to the official briefing of what I had seen with my own eyes the day before, I couldn't recognize it. And if I got up on my feet and said, Colonel, that ain't right, the answer was, son, you just saw from one foxhole. You didn't see the big picture. And I would go out scratching my head thinking, is the big picture a lie? And I guess it was, because that's the way it worked. But that's kind of how the war was covered. Now, I will tell you that I would have loved to have had the technology available then that is available now, because basically we didn't have any technology. I was 3 days in the Ia Drang, and when I finally got out to file my story, I had to catch a ride to Pleiku, to the MACV compound, to the officer club, where they had a phone hooked into the military system. And I got on that phone and I said, Puma, get me Tiger. Tiger, get me Lion. Lion, and so on. And we as correspondents, we were priority 4, lower than whale poop. Any Spec 4 picking up the phone anywhere along the line could knock you off until you learned how to say, this is Colonel Galloway, priority 2. It worked a lot better then. But you would go through about 5 military switches, and at the end of it, you'd say, now, get me Saigon PTT, which is the commercial. And then you would say, this might have taken you 30 or 45 minutes or an hour. And then you would say, get me 51343, which was the phone for the UPI Saigon Bureau. And the guy little Vietnamese would plug it in and dial it, and you get a busy number. That's when you started pulling your hair out and creating new curse words. It could take 4, 5, 6 hours to dictate 400 words to your office in Saigon. You had to find someone to carry your film and get his name and what flight he was on, and arrange to have someone meet him at the other end and collect the film, which then had to be processed and printed and taken to the PTT and put on a radio photo transmitter. You know, all of that now is a sat phone in your pocket, and you know, a laptop and a scanner, and you can do all of that at the speed of light. But back then it was a lot harder way to go. I did that tour in Vietnam. I did 3 others. I went to the Gulf War. I had a great ride because Norm Schwarzkopf and I went back to August of 1965 in the Central Highlands when he was coming out of Dak To or one of those camps up there with his Vietnamese paratroopers, and I marched along with them for part of the way. And Schwarzkopf called me to his headquarters, and he says, I know you want to go with the first cab, but he said, they're in Central Reserve, and this war may be over with before they get a shot or a smell of it. So I'm going to send you to the man I have out here who is most like General Hal Moore as a commander, and the division that has the most challenging and dangerous mission in my battle plan. And I said, damn, Norm, I thought we were friends. He sent me to the 24th Infantry Division mech and Major General Barry McCaffrey, and I had a hell of a ride. And you know, the war was over in 100 hours, and that's the right number. If you can do it and get it over with and go home, and in the whole war, only 290 people died. That's less than died in Landing Zone X-ray and Landing Zone Albany in 4 days in November of 1965. And George Herron talked about the leadership and the lessons from Vietnam. Every commander in the Persian Gulf War had been a lieutenant or a captain in Vietnam. Every one of them had been cannon fodder and were damn well determined that no man would be cannon fodder while they were in command. You had Schwarzkopf at the top, who was a 2-tour Vietnam guy. You had Stan Arthur commanding the naval forces, a Vietnam guy. You had the Air Force commander, Chuck Horner. You had such Vietnam Marine commanders as Mike Myatt, commanding a division. Your overall Marine commander was a Vietnam vet. And they all took the negative lessons from Vietnam, turned them around, and made a successful campaign. We won't ratchet up. We will go in at full strength plus 20%. There'll be no one-year tour. Your tour is victory. And when you've done that, we'll come home. Over and over, the lessons from Vietnam were applied correctly. And then somehow we lost sight of that. And here we are, 10, 12 years in on Afghanistan and Iraq. We thought we were out, and it's coming back to bite us in the ass. Lessons learned and lessons not learned. So anyway, before I go any further down that road, I think I'll just quit and say thank you. God bless you. God bless every American soldier and Marine who stands guard in 120 different countries around this world today. Thank you.